Title of my presentation is Composition and Improvisation in Time-Based Visual Performance. Although most of the time when I'll be referring to time-based visual performance systems, I will just use the term audio-visual performance systems, which could be considered synonymous with visual music systems, where visual music is loosely defined as having a high correlation between audio and visual elements. First, however, I'd like to give a background of my work. I think it would be beneficial in order to show my bias and give some perspective on my interest in this topic. So one of the ways I work as a new media artist is to build devices such as oscillators, sequencers, and synthesizers. They're meant to be sound objects, art objects. This one here in particular is an oscillator, actually 4 oscillators inside a ceramic casing controlled by 1 potentiometer. These are sequencers, and as I said, they're intended to be art objects. So they're designed with this in mind, and I even use a ceramic casing to sort of emphasize this. This is an example of the circuitry. This particular circuitry is from one of the sequencers. It's through-hole soldered. Now I build them from hand-drawn circuit boards. So I actually draw on the circuit board with a Sharpie, usually once or twice, and then etch it with an etching solution. So this further aligns these objects with the visual music tradition, drawing directly on a sound-producing medium, right? In the vein of Norman McLaren and others. And then I use these in audio-visual performance. It's a little bit hard to see there, but I am using the instruments in cooperation with the Arduino board to control processing for, in this case, completely non-objective visuals. Although I'm starting to work in a more figurative way, incorporating short clips of hand-drawn animation. This particular one's called Blue Asher 49, formed at Risky and Brown Pixelerations conference. My collaborator here is Max Alexander. I met in Chicago. We were both influenced by working with Nicholas Collins, author of a book called Handmade Electronic Music, among other things. So, custom and complex systems. Custom and complex systems have become common in audiovisual performance. In the area of computer music, these systems are often compared to musical instruments. Richard Dudas, in an article entitled Comprovisation, the various facets of composed improvisation within interactive performance systems, claims that these systems, quote, should not be designed to perform one lone task, as with a tool, but should be designed to evolve or metamorphose in the hands of a competent performer, in the way that a performer of an acoustic instrument can coax a multitude of seemingly different sounds out of their instrument. While this provides a practical and coherent definition from a historical perspective, the image of hardware and software designed for virtuosic and wide-ranging performances by trained artists may not be the most accurate portrayal of these devices. And I realize we've been talking a lot about visual music devices as instruments, so I don't really mean this to be inflammatory, but it seems to be in opposition to some of the things that we've talked about. Often in regard to audiovisual performance, hardware and software are designed for the performance of a single work and may not be suitable or desirable for entirely new composition and improvisation. It could even be stated that the amount to which a system can be utilized, like a traditional acoustic system, can be determined by its bias toward either composition or improvisation. This intention becomes particularly important in regard to interactive time-based visual art, with its unique goals of exhibition and representation. Yes. So in the light shows of mid-century collaborative groups like Single Wing Turquoise Bird on the left here, and not the theremin, but progress was made toward a more figurative approach to the instrumental nature of visual music by using complex and collaborative systems like the one on the left, taking the focus of the systems away from instruments making direct color note correlations. At the same time, in the nascent field of electronic music, experiments with new performance techniques were breaking with tradition in the form of the acoustic instrument. So that's hence the theremin on the right there. The theremin, perhaps, is still the most popular of these attempts, and is an example of a redefinition of this form. Beyond the nature of the theremin's gestural control, however, it performs notation and pitch in a way that mimics fretless stringed instruments. Sometimes my students even confuse the sound for violin, especially the original. And it would not be until Cage that traditional instrumentality would be significantly challenged. That's not Cage on the left, that's David Tudor, but he's performing one of Cage's pieces called Cartridge Music. And then on the right, we have Imaginary Landscape number 1. The nature of technology in these two pieces proves the form in which it represents itself to be malleable. In both cases, the record player becomes an instrument. On the left, the stylus of the record player is fitted with different types of found objects, anything that will fit in there. So maybe a guitar string, for example. And then on the right, I don't know if this is actually a picture. It's not a picture of Imaginary Landscape number 1, but in Imaginary Landscape number 1, Cage performs the record player in a rudimentary fashion compared to today's DJs basically scratching the record itself. So in both cases, the record player becomes an instrument, showing the ability of technology to offer both composition and improvisation through the same device. This realization provides a foundation for the reconceptualization of systems designed for audiovisual performance. So progressing from analog to digital, the introduction of computer and tools such as Maxim SP, and this paper really focuses on the digital instead of the analog as far as instrumentality is concerned. So the introduction of tools such as Maxim SP, Jitter, Pure Data, Processing, Open Frameworks, now WebGL, has brought unlimited capability to the process of designing systems for performing both audio and video, as well as making connections between the two art forms. With this capability comes complexity, a fundamental issue in designing systems for either composition or improvisation, and perhaps the most important reason to stray from the instrumental model when thinking about these devices. So CEIArtE, a chapter entitled Interactivity in Live Computer Music, from the Cambridge Companion to Electronic Music, states that controllers are not musical instruments. From the same perspective, the computer is too generic to be considered one, properly considered one. Let me get that quote right. And then goes on to say, perhaps even the concept of a musical instrument is just an old romantic burden that would be better left aside. Even though he is speaking about these instruments from a perspective of electronic music, we can conclude by virtue of the close relationship of contemporary visual music to the field of experimental electronic sound performance that designers of these kinds of systems have an incentive to abandon the instrumental form in favor of one that emphasizes uniqueness. In other words, systems that are designed to perform a single conceptual work as opposed to those that are meant to showcase virtuosity or technology. One intriguing example of an audio-visual performance system such as this, I think, is Ben Taylor's The Opal Church, although to my chagrin it's poorly documented. So I'll see what I can do to show you the feel of the piece. But it's created in Ajax, JavaScript, and Maximus P. But the piece does not expose the tools it was created with. By manipulating HTML in real time, the often complex and chaotic language Maximus P here serves only to place QuickTime sound clips, videos, and text poorly onto the blank white page of a web browser. What unfolds to the audience over the course of a roughly 30-minute performance on one rudimentary-looking web page and some pop-up windows is a piece that manages to make posting content on the internet feel like a sad but serenely emotive part of the human experience. The structural blocks of content are in large part pre-composed. By nature of being QuickTime clips, which leaves the performer to focus wholly on improvising formal elements affecting the overall feel of the piece, such as layering audio, placement of images, and pacing, while this content could be performed by others as an instrument, it is the bias toward composition that gives it the ability to be defined more like an art object than an instrument. The meaning changes little with improvisation, enough to be appreciated as a performative gesture, balancing content and craft, but not enough to make it function like a traditional instrument. Though not a piece of visual music in any purest sense of the definition, it's definitely more figurative than objective or non-objective. It uses the structure of music to create a contemporary audiovisual performance system that transcends the technology it's based on. So, I'd like to show you just a couple. I'm going to skip around a lot here. Rather long. In this case, it's collaborative, although when I viewed it, it was performed by a single performer, which I preferred, actually. It made the piece a little more intimate, I thought. It's hard to see. Starts off slowly. the piece, I didn't focus on the technology at all, and that could have been because I didn't know how it was done. You know, I was familiar with the tools that he was using, but I did ask him afterwards, and it was some sort of Ajax trick with Google servers, but he's able to post on the internet in real time. Anyway, in the examples of pieces like this, we should find that the instrument has not been lost, but rather absorbed by an autonomous model in which the computer can be seen as producing, storing, and recalling sonic events that stem from the granular to fully composed, running parallel to or in conjunction with graphical events. This kind of system removes any imposed limits of control or gesture and provides the opportunity for more of the vocabulary of music to be applied to these performance devices. Instead of merely a control surface, the computer becomes a collaborative partner, one that can be designed to perform as a kind of machine musician. Here, human-computer interaction becomes an improvisational dialogue. The success of this dialogue depends on a knowledge of the system that comes from intimacy with the design of both the software and the hardware. The design of these two elements limits the complexity of the system and determines the overall feel of a performance. In light of this, we can see the design of the system itself is a composition.
4 minutes.
Okay. Pieces performed with these types of systems can be fully composed or fully improvisational, but well-designed devices ideally involve both to fully make use of the medium. In regard to composition, is the design of the control that limits the complexity of computer-based systems and helps to impart the feel of the performance. Control can come from the touch, pressure, proximity, light, temperature, almost anything, as long as it can be interpreted into data. The design of these types of gestures creates the machine-performer dialogue. An artist designing this type of interaction is taking on the role of luthier and composer, as interactive gestures will be determined, interactive gestures will determine how the system is controlled, supervised, managed, or observed. CEIArtE states concerning this relationship between gesture and control that a single articulation can elicit not just one note, but an entire structural block. Live musical performance cannot be separated from control and gesture. By allowing gestures to control structure in such a way, artists can be free to focus on the most performative aspects. Gestures can control specific elements directly or groups of pre-composed elements. Automated improvisatory elements can reverse the role, influencing gestures and providing feedback. This facilitates a dialogue between performers and the systems they design. So to find an example that incorporates an instrument-like controller, we may look to Luc Dubois, who's famous for writing jitter, and his work Bioluminescence. In this piece, Luc Dubois performed software written for the piece on a laptop without external controls, while a second performer, Leslie Flanagan, provides vocals that are affected, amplified, and used to control live visual data. The live visual data consists of a series of circles that draw themselves across the projection from left to right. I think I'm going to skip over some of this description. But point here is that the dialogue between human input and machine makes the system a one-of-a-kind performance dedicated to be performed as the art object, bioluminescence. It's a standalone piece, and I'm just going to show really briefly here sort of one of the series of compositions. The composition renews itself each time the circle respawns on the left side of the screen. Some of the moments here are more interesting than others. So here you have an example of both a system that uses an instrument-like control, but I wouldn't really still call it an instrument, because the whole system of itself is really designed to be a standalone art piece. It's really only performed as bioluminescence, and it always will be performed as bioluminescence. So because the nature of this dialogue can easily become chaotic, composition in audiovisual performance systems should be achieved by designing hardware and software that limits this complexity. Chaos in these systems has become commonplace, as the tools behind them are often allowed to take control of visual and sonic elements. An uncontrolled or poorly composed patch from maximum speed jitter is recognizable. In the same way, only the most well-programmed sketches made in processing hide the characteristics of the language. These languages and others like them have distinct properties that can betray themselves during performance. Well-designed systems will be able to avoid this. By the same token, performers well acquainted with the systems they are using have the opportunity to show virtuosity by experimenting with familiar elements in new and creative ways. For example, the familiar gesture of controlling voltage with a potentiometer often results in a linear expectation. We expect to see something linear, hear something linear, but familiarity with the system provides us with new ways of controlling, perhaps mapping through analog to digital conversion, specific points on the linear potentiometer that trigger certain events. So, because technology offers an unlimited ability for creating audio and visual elements, many attempts have been made to use it to create new instruments. Beyond those based specifically on their acoustic counterparts, such as electric guitars and keyboards, it would be difficult to find examples of any that have been widely adopted in the same way that electric guitars and keyboards are musical instruments. Instead, we find software and hardware intended to perform specific and unique content, and taking on the role of art objects that can be conceptually valued and critiqued, as well as documented and archived. Certain techniques of composition and improvisation can be employed to create art objects such as these. For example, imposing limits in order to control chaos and complexity, exposing dialogue between computer and human performers, and attention to detail in hardware-software interaction. These techniques work to suppress the lifeless nature of technology in order to foreground strong conceptual ideas, or in the case of visual music performance, strong formal composition.